The little black girl warned the biker someone dragged a child into a sealed bay beneath the border facility. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. The sun had just set over the quiet town near the US-Mexico border. The night was cool, but the air was thick with the buzz of cicadas. At a small biker bar, a group of rugged men gathered around a table, their leather jackets gleaming in the dim light. The scent of gasoline, beer, and old leather filled the air. They had been unwinding after a long ride, not knowing that tonight they would be thrust into a nightmare. Then, the door opened, and in rushed a small black girl, no more than 10 years old, her eyes wide with terror. She was barefoot, her dress torn at the edges, and her hair, once neatly braided, was now disheveled. She was gasping for breath, clearly panicked. "Please," she cried. "They took my brother. They dragged him into a sealed bay beneath the border facility. You have to help him." The men looked at each other, uncertain at first. It wasn't uncommon for trouble to find them, but something in the girl's eyes told them this was different. She wasn't making things up. This was real. One of the bikers, a man with a weathered face and a scar running down his cheek, stood up. His name was Forge, and he had been through hell and back in his life, but he knew when something was truly wrong. "What do you mean, sealed bay?" he asked, his voice low but steady. The girl, still trembling, wiped her eyes and nodded, pointing toward the border facility in the distance. "I don't know exactly where, but they took him there. I heard them, the guards. I saw them drag him inside. Please, you have to save him." Forge exchanged a glance with his brothers. This was no ordinary kidnapping. The border facility was a place they knew well, but the idea of a child being dragged into a sealed bay beneath it was something none of them could ignore. It was illegal, it was dangerous, and it was a call to action. The group quickly sprang into motion. They couldn't waste time. Forge grabbed his phone and began typing a message to the rest of the crew. Within minutes, the response flooded in. "We're in. Where are we going? Let's do this." These were his brothers, people who had his back no matter what. Forge turned to the girl and knelt down to her level. "We're going to get your brother," he said firmly, "but you have to stay here, okay? You'll be safe with us." The girl nodded, tears still streaming down her face. As Forge stood up, the bikers quickly prepared. Helmets on, engines started, and the roar of the motorcycles filled the night air. The ride was about to begin, and they had no idea what they were about to face. They revved their engines and sped off, the sound of the motorcycles echoing through the night, a promise of justice in the distance. The facility loomed in the darkness ahead, its high walls a silent sentinel over the secrets held inside. But tonight, those secrets were about to be exposed. Forge and his brothers were on their way to rescue a child. They wouldn't stop until the job was done, no matter the cost. As they approached the facility, their hearts pounded. They knew this wouldn't be easy, and they had no idea what awaited them inside the sealed bay. But one thing was certain, they weren't going to let a child suffer alone. The riders pushed forward, knowing the stakes had just become higher than ever. Taking off from the last moment, Forge and his brothers rode through the darkened streets, their engines roaring in unison. The wind whipped through their leather jackets, but no one spoke. The air was thick with tension, and the only sound was the rumbling of the motorcycles beneath them. They had a mission, and it was clear. Save the child. Forge's heart pounded as they neared the facility. His mind raced, wondering what they would face. They were a group of outlaws, but they were also a family, and there was no way they would let a child be hurt under their watch. The border facility loomed ahead, a massive, imposing structure surrounded by high fences, barbed wire, and floodlights that cut through the darkness. It seemed like a fortress, but Forge wasn't intimidated. He had faced worse. The question was, what was really going on behind those walls? As they approached, Forge signaled to his crew to spread out. They couldn't just storm the facility blindly. They needed a plan. The facility had to be breached carefully. They were looking at a highly secured area, and any wrong move could alert the authorities, leading to a full-on confrontation they couldn't afford. Forge's mind raced as they slowed down, their bikes creeping toward the gates. The place looked eerily quiet, but Forge knew better than to let his guard down. It was too quiet. They parked in a nearby alley, a safe distance away from the facility. The crew dismounted, each member moving with practiced precision. They all understood their roles in this operation. Some were to scout, others to secure the perimeter, and a few were tasked with finding the sealed bay the little girl had described. Forge turned to his right-hand man, Wrench, a tall, burly biker with a no-nonsense attitude. You and Diesel check the north side. See if you can find an entry point. Stay low and keep it quiet. Wrench nodded. He was the best at getting in and out without being noticed. Got it. We'll move fast, Wrench said, his voice gruff but steady. Forge then turned to his other trusted ally, Phantom. You and Storm will cover the south side. I need eyes on every angle. This place isn't a joke. Phantom, a former Navy SEAL with a sharp mind for tactics, flashed a small, knowing smile. We'll have it covered. Don't worry about it. Forge's gaze lingered on the perimeter of the facility. His thoughts turned to the little girl who had warned them. What had she seen? Why was there a child in such a dangerous place? These questions ate at him, but he pushed them aside. His focus was on the mission at hand. The rest of the crew, including Crow, Inferno, and Shadow, quietly spread out, each man knowing his task. The silence of the night weighed heavily on them as they made their way toward their positions. Forge took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the high walls of the facility. They were about to do something dangerous, something that could change their lives forever, but there was no turning back now. It was for the child. They needed to find out what was going on beneath this facility, and they needed to do it fast. The seconds ticked by, each one stretching longer than the last. Every movement was measured, deliberate. They could hear the faint hum of machinery in the distance, a sign that the facility was still operational. Forge glanced back at his team one more time. No mistakes, he muttered under his breath. Just then, Wrench and Diesel returned, their faces grim. Found a way in, Wrench said, his voice low. There's a small service entrance on the north side. It's not heavily guarded, but we'll need to move fast. Forge nodded, his heart picking up pace. Let's move. We get in, find the child, and get out. No matter what. They didn't waste another second. The team moved as one, slipping through the shadows, their steps quiet but purposeful. The clock was ticking, and they knew the longer they stayed here, the more dangerous it would become. As they approached the service entrance, the adrenaline surged through Forge's veins. He could feel the weight of the mission pressing down on him. The fate of a child, and maybe even their own lives, depended on their next moves. They reached the door, and with a swift motion, Forge unlocked it. The team slipped inside, disappearing into the darkness of the facility. There was no turning back now. They were in. What they would find in the depths of the facility was unknown, but they were ready to face whatever came their way. The child's life was in their hands, and they wouldn't stop until she was safe. As Forge and his crew silently made their way deeper into the facility, the air grew colder, and the hum of the machinery became louder, echoing through the narrow hallways. The only sound now was the steady, calculated footsteps of the bikers as they moved through the darkened interior. Forge's mind was focused entirely on the mission ahead. They had already passed several empty rooms, their concrete walls chipped and worn, a stark contrast to the pristine exterior of the facility. He signaled to Wrench and Diesel to check the next corner while he, along with Phantom and Storm, continued down the hallway. The darkness seemed to stretch for miles, but Forge knew they were getting closer to the heart of the facility, the sealed bay the girl had mentioned. The air felt heavier as they approached what seemed to be the final set of doors. These doors were larger, reinforced with steel, and had a security code lock on the side. Forge motioned for Phantom to check the system, while Storm kept watch. The tension was thick, and Forge could feel the weight of time pressing against him. We need to hurry, Forge muttered under his breath, his eyes scanning the area for any sign of movement. Phantom nodded, quickly working on the keypad. Seconds felt like minutes, but then the familiar click of the door unlocking echoed through the hallway. Without hesitation, Forge pushed the door open, the heavy steel swinging inward with a loud screech. Inside, the bay was dimly lit by flickering fluorescent lights. The air was musty, filled with the smell of metal and rust. As they stepped in, Forge immediately noticed the shadows cast by large crates and piles of unused equipment. The room was more like a warehouse than a secure area. He scanned the room carefully, his eyes darting between every corner, looking for any sign of the child. Where is she? Forge thought, his heart pounding as he looked around. Then, from the far corner of the room, he saw a figure. A child, curled up on the cold concrete floor, her small body trembling. It was her, the little girl. She was lying there, but her eyes were wide open, fear and confusion written all over her face. Forge's heart skipped a beat. He rushed forward, his boots clicking against the floor, but the moment he reached her side, a voice stopped him dead in his tracks. Not so fast. The voice was calm, but it had a certain authority to it. Forge spun around, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife at his side, but he was met by a man in a black suit, standing just a few feet away. The man was calm, almost too calm, as if he had expected them. Forge's gaze hardened. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice low and controlled. The man smiled, a smug look crossing his face. "I think you know exactly who I am," he replied, his voice smooth. "But I'm sure you've figured out by now that you've walked right into a trap." Forge's mind raced. A trap? How had they been caught? He looked around, trying to assess the situation. The others had already positioned themselves, but the man in the suit wasn't alone. A few more figures appeared from the shadows, their eyes glinting with malice. Forge realized they had walked straight into an ambush. This wasn't just about rescuing a child, it was about much more. His grip on the knife tightened as he prepared himself for a confrontation. But the man in the suit wasn't finished. "I admire your courage, but you're outmatched," the man continued, his eyes scanning the room. "You see, this facility isn't just a place for border control. It's part of something much bigger, something you've unknowingly stumbled into." Forge narrowed his eyes, his senses on high alert. He could feel the danger closing in. This was no longer just about saving a child. They had walked into something far more dangerous than they could have imagined. The man in the suit stepped closer, a smug grin still on his face. "I don't suppose you've heard of Project Silent Night, have you?" Forge's stomach sank. Project Silent Night. He had no idea what the man was talking about, but one thing was certain. He had walked straight into a conspiracy that could cost them everything. The man took another step forward, and before Forge could react, he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind him. They weren't alone. The rest of the bikers had arrived, but they were too late. The door slammed shut, and they were trapped. "We'll see how long you last," the man in the suit said, his grin widening. Forge's heart pounded in his chest as he assessed their dwindling options. This was bad, really bad, but one thing was clear. They couldn't let the child, any of them, fall into the hands of these people, not while they still had a breath in their bodies. Forge stood frozen, his eyes locked on the man in the suit as he smirked at the growing tension. The sound of the doors slamming shut echoed through the facility like the final nail in a coffin. They were trapped. The man's smug expression was enough to fuel the rage building inside Forge. His fingers tightened around the handle of his knife, ready to strike. The rest of the bikers, storming into the room behind him, moved into position, forming a protective circle around the girl. Wrench and Diesel positioned themselves by the exit, their eyes scanning for any possible escape route. But it was clear, there was nowhere to go. The man in the suit, still wearing his condescending grin, slowly raised his hands, signaling for the bikers to stay calm. "You really thought you could just walk in here and walk out with the girl?" he asked, his voice dripping with mockery. Forge's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Who the hell are you?" Forge's voice was steady, but beneath it, the simmering anger was unmistakable. The man in the suit didn't flinch. "My name is Cole," he replied smoothly, "and I'm the one who controls everything that happens here. You're not getting out, not without a fight, and certainly not with the girl." Forge stepped forward, the tension in the air so thick it was nearly suffocating. "Why don't you just tell us what you're really up to?" Forge demanded, his tone cold. Cole smiled, clearly enjoying the game. "What we're doing is much bigger than you could understand," he said, pacing slowly as if he was the one in control. "This facility isn't just about border security. It's about controlling information, controlling people. And your little rescue mission? It's only going to make things worse for everyone involved." Forge's mind raced. "What the hell are you talking about?" he growled. Cole stopped pacing and faced the bikers. "I'm talking about Project Silent Night," he said, the words hanging in the air like a death sentence. "This child you're trying to save? She's just the tip of the iceberg. There are hundreds like her, and they all have something we need. Something valuable. The words hit Forge like a slap in the face. You're using kids? He asked, his voice thick with disgust. Cole's smile widened, his eyes glinting with something cold and calculating. You're damn right we are, he said, the cruelty in his voice unmistakable. These children are part of a larger plan. A plan that involves the most powerful people in the world. And you think you can just waltz in here and change everything? Forge's heart was pounding. He had never imagined anything like this. This wasn't just a case of child trafficking. This was something far more sinister, something that went deeper than they could have ever imagined. Forge's mind snapped back to the task at hand. He couldn't let Cole's words distract him. We're taking her, Forge said firmly, his voice leaving no room for negotiation. You can try, Cole replied, his voice oozing with confidence. But you'll regret it. This isn't just about a few bikers trying to play the hero. There's more at stake than you know. And you're already out of your league. Just as Cole finished speaking, a group of armed men appeared from the shadows, their weapons trained on the bikers. Forge's eyes flicked to the girl on the floor. She was still trembling, but her wide eyes were filled with fear and desperation. This wasn't just about rescuing a child anymore. This was about surviving, about making sure that this facility's dark secrets didn't destroy everything. Get her out of here, Forge ordered, his voice sharp and commanding. The bikers didn't hesitate. Wrench and Diesel moved swiftly to the girl's side, lifting her gently but quickly. Forge's mind raced as he calculated their next move. He knew they couldn't win a firefight against these armed men, but they could fight their way out if they were smart about it. Storm, Phantom, Forge barked, cover the exits. Wrench, Diesel, get her to safety. The bikers moved into action, quickly and efficiently. Forge stayed behind, facing Cole and his men. The standoff was tense, but Forge's mind was sharp. He knew the only way out was through. You're making a mistake, Cole said, his voice eerily calm. You think you can fight us? You have no idea who you're dealing with. Maybe not, Forge replied, but I know one thing. You're not going to hurt anyone else. And with that, Forge lunged forward, his knife flashing in the dim light. It wasn't just about saving the girl anymore. It was about taking down the monsters who had been pulling the strings behind the scenes. As the battle broke out, Forge's thoughts were clear. No matter the cost, he would make sure this nightmare ended tonight. The room erupted into chaos as Forge lunged toward Cole, his knife flashing in the dim light. But before he could strike, the armed men fired warning shots. The sound of gunfire echoed through the facility, sharp and deafening. Forge ducked instinctively, his mind already processing. The next move. He could hear the thunderous roar of motorcycles outside, a reminder that his crew wasn't far. The girl, still shaking, was now safely in the arms of Wrench and Diesel, who were making their way toward the back exit. Forge's focus shifted back to the immediate danger. He had to keep the armed men off his back long enough for his team to get away. Take cover, Forge shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. He rolled behind a stack of crates, his heart racing as he drew his gun. The bikers took their positions, some moving swiftly to flank the enemy, while others remained behind the crates, ready to fight. Storm, Phantom, and Crow formed a defensive line, covering the group's exit route. The armed men were taking cover behind the walls and doors, but Forge had the upper hand. He knew this place like the back of his hand, and every room, every corner, could be used to their advantage. Stay low, move fast, Forge barked. The bikers followed his command, using the facility's layout to their advantage. The enemy wasn't prepared for the swift and strategic movements of the Thunderwolves MC. Forge fired a shot, hitting one of the armed men in the shoulder, forcing him to retreat. The man screamed, but his comrades were already rushing to provide cover. We don't have much time, Forge thought. We need to get out before reinforcements arrive. He glanced over at the girl, who was now huddled behind Wrench and Diesel, her small body trembling with fear. He couldn't let her down. He couldn't let them all down. The sound of more footsteps, heavier this time, sounded in the distance. More of them, Forge thought, frustration building. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. They couldn't keep up this fight for much longer. The facility was massive, and every minute they spent in here was a minute closer to the authorities showing up. Just then, he heard a familiar sound, the roar of a motorcycle engine. followed by the screech of tires skidding to a stop. The cavalry had arrived. The Thunderwolves MC had made it to the rear entrance, their bikes roaring like an unstoppable force. Forge could hear the distinctive growl of his brother's engines, and for the first time in what felt like hours, he allowed himself a brief moment of hope. "Let's end this," Forge muttered under his breath, turning to his crew. Wrench, Diesel, Storm, and Phantom took positions near the back exit, covering the area as Forge moved to join them. The bikers in the facility made their move. They weren't just fighting to rescue a child anymore. They were fighting for their lives. Forge, with the adrenaline coursing through his veins, was ready to make the final push. He knew they couldn't stay here any longer, but they also couldn't let Cole and his men win. The bikers advanced, weapons in hand, their hearts pounding in unison. As they moved toward the main door, the sound of the motorcycles revving grew louder. They could hear the sound of their brothers charging toward the entrance. They were outnumbered, but the Thunderwolves MC were used to being the underdogs. The facility was a fortress, but they were determined to break through. Forge and his crew made their way to the front, taking down any opposition that stood in their way. The armed men fought back fiercely, but the bikers weren't backing down. Forge could feel the rush of victory pushing him forward. He glanced back at the girl, still being shielded by Wrench and Diesel, and knew that this was their last chance to get her out safely. The doors to the main exit were just ahead, and the sound of motorcycles roaring outside grew louder with each passing second. But as they approached, the doors slammed shut, trapping them inside. Not again, Forge thought, panic rising in his chest. Just as the armed men closed in, a massive explosion shook the building, throwing everyone off balance. The walls cracked, debris falling around them. Forge barely managed to keep his footing as he looked up to see the source of the blast. His brothers had set off a controlled detonation outside. The building was starting to collapse, and the bikers had one final chance to escape. "Get to the bikes," Forge yelled, pushing forward through the chaos. With one final push, the bikers rushed toward the exit, the facility crumbling around them. The girl, now in their care, was held tightly by Diesel, who was leading the charge. The sound of motorcycles revving and the blast of hot air from the collapsing building filled the air. They were almost there. Forge glanced back, his heart pounding. The explosion had created a path. The bikers rushed through, narrowly avoiding the falling debris, and made it to the waiting motorcycles just in time. "We're out," Forge said, his voice hoarse but triumphant. As they rode away from the facility, the sound of the collapse faded into the distance. The girl was safe. The Thunderwolves MC had once again proven that loyalty and brotherhood could overcome anything, even the darkest of forces. As the dust settled and the sound of crumbling concrete faded into the distance, Forge and his crew pushed their bikes harder, the engines growling as they tore through the rugged terrain. The girl, now safe but still shaken, clung to Diesel, her small arms wrapped tightly around his waist. They had made it out of the facility, but the battle wasn't over. They were still deep in hostile territory, and Forge's mind raced, calculating their next move. The feeling of urgency was thick in the air, but for a moment, Forge allowed himself a brief glance at his crew. His brothers. Despite the chaos they had just escaped, they had kept their heads. They were together, and they had made sure the girl was safe. That was all that mattered. But the reality of the situation hit him hard. They had no idea what they were dealing with. The man in the suit, Cole, had hinted at something much larger than they could have anticipated. Project Silent Night. That was the name that haunted Forge's thoughts. What had they just uncovered? And why had Cole's men been so ready to stop them? The answers to those questions were buried deep in the shadows, but Forge wasn't about to back down now. He had seen the terror in the girl's eyes. He had heard the fear in her voice as she described what had happened. It was clear that this was only the beginning. "We need to get her to safety," Forge muttered to himself, his grip tightening on the handlebars. They had to put miles between themselves and the facility before they could truly relax. But Forge knew that the danger wasn't over. The government, the people behind Project Silent Night, none of them would just let this go. He glanced at the girl again. "We'll keep you safe," he promised under his breath. Wrench, who was riding just ahead of Forge, looked over his shoulder and gave a quick nod. "We've got a long ride ahead," he said, his voice steady. "But we'll make it. We always do." Forge didn't reply. His mind was already spinning with the possibilities. The girl's family had been torn apart by whatever was going on behind the scenes at the border facility. Her life had been destroyed, and Forge couldn't help but think that hers was just one of many. As they rode through the night, the group stayed in constant motion, never stopping for more than a few minutes. They needed to put as much distance between them and the facility as possible, but it was clear that they couldn't rest. Every highway they took seemed to be another step into danger. After hours of riding, the first hint of daylight broke over the horizon, casting long shadows over the desolate highway. Forge's muscles ached from the constant tension, but he pushed through it. His crew was still strong, still focused. They had survived far worse, and this time was no different. The girl had begun to fall asleep, her head resting against Diesel's back. Her exhaustion was evident, but the fear still clung to her like a second skin. Forge knew they had to find a place to lay low for a while, somewhere off the beaten path where they could regroup. "There's a cabin up ahead," Storm called out, breaking the silence. "We can hold up there for a few hours, maybe longer. It's off the main roads, so it should be safe for now." Forge nodded, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. They were getting closer to safety, but he knew it wouldn't last long. They had to be careful, stay one step ahead of anyone who might be hunting them. As they pulled up to the cabin, the sun had barely risen, and the light was still soft, casting a warm glow over the area. It was an old, rustic place, hidden away from prying eyes. Forge knew it wouldn't be much, but for now, it would have to do. The crew dismounted, their movements swift and efficient. Wrench and Diesel helped the girl off the bike, making sure she was steady on her feet before guiding her inside. The others quickly set up a perimeter around the cabin, checking for any signs of danger. Forge took a deep breath and stepped inside. The cabin was small, but cozy, with a stone fireplace and a few old wooden chairs scattered around. It wasn't much, but it would provide the shelter they needed for the time being. Forge motioned for the girl to sit on one of the chairs, and Wrench gently guided her to it. "You're safe now," Wrench said, his voice calm and reassuring. The girl looked up at him, her wide eyes filled with gratitude and fear. "Thank you," she whispered. Forge knelt in front of her, meeting her gaze. "We're not done yet," he said softly. "We'll keep you safe, but we need to know everything you remember. You said something about Project Silent Night. Can you tell us more?" The girl swallowed hard, her hands shaking slightly. "I don't know much," she said, her voice trembling. "But I heard them talking. They were going to use kids like me for something. Something big. They said they were going to change everything." Forge's heart sank. He knew they had to stop whatever was coming, but they didn't have all the pieces yet. "We'll figure it out," he said, his voice firm. "But for now, you rest. We'll handle the rest." The girl nodded, her eyes drifting closed as exhaustion overtook her. Forge stood up and walked to the window, his mind still racing. There was so much more to uncover, so many questions unanswered. But one thing was certain, whatever Project Silent Night was, it had to be stopped. And Forge would make sure it was. With his brothers by his side, he knew they could face whatever came next. The morning sun filtered through the trees as the group settled in the small cabin, trying to find some semblance of normalcy amidst the chaos. Forge stood by the window, looking out over the quiet landscape. It was hard to believe just hours ago they had been fighting for their lives in the darkened depths of a border facility. Now, they were here, trying to catch their breath, but Forge knew this was just a brief pause. The calm before the storm. His thoughts returned to the girl, still resting in one of the chairs. She had been through so much, and yet she still clung to the hope that someone would help her. That someone was them. He had promised her they would keep her safe, but deep down, Forge knew that keeping her safe meant uncovering the full scope of Project Silent Night. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than just a few corrupted officials or criminals. This was bigger, far bigger than anything they had imagined. The silence in the cabin was broken when Diesel, who had been standing guard outside, walked in. His face was grim, his posture stiff. Forge turned to him, his hand instinctively resting on the handle of his knife. Diesel didn't need to say anything. The look on his face said it all. "What is it?" Forge asked, his voice low. Diesel hesitated for a moment before answering. "We've got company," he said, his voice rough. "A few miles out. Looks like they're coming for us." Forge's stomach tightened. They didn't have much time. He turned to the others. "Get ready," he said. "We're not staying here long." Wrench, who had been pacing the cabin's small living room, immediately started checking his weapons, while Phantom went to the back window, peering through the cracks in the wood. The crew was already on edge, but they were a well-oiled machine. They had been through worse. "What's the plan?" Storm asked, his voice calm, but with an edge of urgency. Forge didn't waste time. "We need to get out of here. We can't afford to be caught in the open. We'll head to the North Road, take the back trails. It's a longer route, but it'll give us the cover we need." Diesel nodded. "I'll make sure the bikes are ready," he said, heading out the door again. Forge watched him go, his mind racing. They had no idea how many people were after them, but it was clear that the people behind Project Silent Night weren't just going to sit back and let them go. They were about to find out just how deep this conspiracy ran. The girl stirred in her seat, rubbing her eyes. She looked up at Forge, her expression still filled with fear. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice small, almost fragile. Forge approached her slowly, kneeling down to her level. "We're leaving, kid," he said, his tone firm but gentle. "Stay close to us. You're going to be okay." The girl nodded, her small face set with determination. For the first time since they found her, Forge saw a flicker of hope in her eyes. It gave him a sense of resolve. They couldn't fail her. They wouldn't. As they quickly packed up their things and prepared to leave the cabin, the sounds of approaching vehicles grew louder. Forge motioned for everyone to get into position. Wrench, Storm, and Phantom took up their positions by the back door, while Diesel, having readied the bikes, stood at the front, watching the horizon. It wouldn't be long before they were surrounded. Forge checked his watch. 10 minutes, maybe 15, before their pursuers would be on them. He could feel the adrenaline starting to course through his veins, but he remained calm, keeping his focus. The sound of tires crunching on the dirt road reached his ears. He motioned for Diesel to rev up the bikes, and they quickly mounted, ready to make their move. The bikes roared to life, their engines echoing through the quiet morning. Forge, Wrench, Diesel, and Storm led the way, with Phantom and the girl following behind. They shot down the trail, the familiar rush of wind in their faces as they navigated the rough terrain. The cabin quickly disappeared behind them, swallowed up by the trees and the hills. The group moved fast, but the sound of the vehicles behind them grew louder with each passing second. Forge knew the chase was on. They had to lose their pursuers, but it wasn't going to be easy. The back trails weren't always smooth, and they were going to need all their skills to make it through without getting cornered. As they hit a sharp turn in the trail, Forge glanced behind them, his eyes narrowing. The vehicles were gaining on them. The bikers picked up speed, the sound of the engines roaring louder in the distance. "Hold on," Forge called out over the roar of the wind. The girl, still clinging to Diesel, tightened her grip. "We're almost there," Forge thought, pushing the bike faster. They had to reach the next checkpoint, a secluded area where they could regroup. But they weren't out of the woods yet. As the pursuit continued, Forge's thoughts returned to the girl and Project Silent Night. The deeper they got into this, the more dangerous it became. He knew they were about to face a fight unlike any other, but one thing was clear, they weren't backing down. They had come this far, and they were going to finish it, no matter the cost. The roar of the motorcycles echoed through the narrow trail, their engines thundering as they pushed forward, cutting through the dense forest with ease. Forge, at the front of the pack, kept his eyes fixed on the path ahead, his mind focused on the next step. The girl, still clinging tightly to Diesel, seemed to have calmed down a little, but Forge could see the fear still lingering in her eyes. They were moving fast, but the sound of vehicles closing in behind them told him they didn't have much time. The trees were thinning out ahead, and Forge could just make out the clearing they needed to reach, a small, remote outpost deep in the woods where they could regroup and figure out their next move. But the pursuit was relentless. The vehicles following them had picked up speed, and Forge could hear their engines getting louder, the chase closing in. He pushed his bike harder, the wind whipping past him as he accelerated, but he knew they couldn't outrun them forever. They needed to make their stand. He glanced over his shoulder, spotting the black SUVs weaving through the trees, their headlights shining like glowing eyes in the distance. Forge's heart pounded as the vehicles picked up speed, their engines roaring like predators closing in on their prey. "We can't outrun them," Forge thought. "It's time to fight." The clearing was getting closer, but Forge knew they needed to lose their pursuers first. He veered off the trail to the left, taking a sharp turn that threw him sideways, but the bike held firm. The others followed suit, each biker maneuvering through the dense trees with practiced precision. The sound of the SUVs grew louder as they followed them, but Forge had a plan. He wasn't going to let them catch them. The forest ahead was thick with underbrush, but it also had a few small hills and dips that could be used to their advantage. Forge and the crew were used to unpredictable terrain. They'd faced rougher conditions before. As they tore through the forest, Forge's thoughts flashed to the girl. What had she been through? What kind of world had she come from that brought her to this point? She was just a kid, but now she was caught up in something much bigger than any of them had imagined. As the pack of bikers charged through the forest, Forge could hear the engines of the pursuers following them, their headlights cutting through the trees like a pair of vultures. But Forge wasn't about to let them get any closer. He weaved through the trees, trying to stay out of their line of sight while maintaining his speed. Just a little longer, he thought, as his bike hit a small rise in the ground, giving him a momentary burst of speed. In the distance, the clearing was just ahead. They were almost there. But then, Forge's heart skipped a beat. A loud screeching sound came from behind him, followed by a burst of gunfire that sliced through the air. Damn it, Forge muttered, instinctively ducking as the bullets zipped past him. He quickly glanced back and saw one of the black SUVs closing the gap, its tires sliding as it attempted to cut around the trees. Forge swerved to the right, narrowly avoiding a tree, but he didn't slow down. The bikers needed to reach the clearing. They needed to make their stand. As the clearing came into view, Forge's mind raced. He could see the familiar outpost ahead, its weathered wooden walls standing like a fortress in the middle of the woods. It was their last chance. He pushed forward, urging his bike faster. The others were close behind, their engines roaring as they followed his lead. Just as they reached the edge of the clearing, Forge looked over his shoulder once more. The SUVs were almost on top of them, but Forge wasn't going to let them catch up. He kicked his bike into a higher gear, blasting into the open space and heading straight for the outpost. The rest of the bikers followed, barreling into the clearing just behind him. As they reached the entrance of the outpost, they skidded to a halt, tires screeching against the dirt. Forge quickly dismounted, scanning the area for any immediate threats. The other bikers were already positioning themselves, making sure the perimeter was secure. Diesel helped the girl off the bike, and Forge rushed over to her. "Stay close," he said, his voice steady but urgent. She nodded, still clinging to Diesel, her wide eyes scanning the area. Forge turned to his crew. "We're not safe yet." "They're coming," he said, his voice low but commanding. Wrench nodded, checking his rifle and ensuring that everyone was armed. Phantom and Storm were already securing the entrance, keeping a close eye on the surrounding forest. The sound of the approaching SUVs grew louder, and Forge's heart rate quickened. They didn't have much time. "We've got one chance," Forge said, his voice filled with determination. "We take them out here and now, or we don't make it out at all." The bikers positioned themselves around the outpost, preparing for the inevitable confrontation. The sound of the SUVs getting closer was deafening now. It wouldn't be long before they would be surrounded. Forge's eyes narrowed. They weren't going to let anyone take this girl. Not today. "Get ready," Forge growled. The battle for their lives was about to begin. The rumble of the approaching SUVs grew louder, their engines roaring through the woods like thunder, signaling that the confrontation was imminent. Forge and his crew had positioned themselves in the clearing, ready for what was about to come. Their bikes, parked in a defensive formation, were the only thing between them and the armed men who had been chasing them for miles. Forge's heart pounded in his chest, but he kept his focus sharp. His eyes scanned the tree line, waiting for the first sign of movement. He could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy, as the sound of the vehicles continued to close in. Diesel stood beside him, his hand gripping his rifle tightly, ready to react at a moment's notice. The girl, still shaken but now more composed, clung to Diesel's side, her wide eyes darting from one biker to another, sensing the danger in the air. Wrench, Storm, Phantom, and the others were positioned around the outpost, their weapons ready. They had faced countless dangers before, but this was different. This time, they weren't just fighting for their lives, they were fighting for the girl's future. The rumble of the engines grew louder as the SUVs entered the clearing, the headlights cutting through the trees like searching eyes. Forge's instincts kicked in, and he raised his rifle, motioning for everyone to stay low. They had one shot at this, and Forge wasn't about to waste it. Stay focused, he muttered under his breath. Wait for my signal. The first SUV emerged from the trees, its headlights blinding in the dim morning light. It skidded to a halt just a few yards from where Forge and the others stood, and the door swung open. Armed men spilled out, weapons in hand, eyes scanning the area. They were expecting a fight. Forge's grip tightened on his rifle as he crouched low behind the cover of a nearby boulder. He could feel the adrenaline building inside him, his senses heightened. The moment they'd been waiting for had arrived. The leader of the armed men, a tall figure wearing a dark suit, stepped out of the SUV. Forge's eyes narrowed as he recognized him. Cole, the man who had orchestrated everything. Cole's cold, calculating gaze swept across the bikers, a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. You really thought you could get away, didn't you? Cole called out, his voice mocking. This ends here. Forge's pulse quickened, but he kept his cool. Not today, he said, his voice low and steady. We're not leaving without her. Cole's smile faded, and he motioned for his men to move in. But before they could take another step, Forge gave the signal. In an instant, gunfire erupted, the sharp crack of rifle shots breaking the silence. The bikers opened fire, taking down the first wave of armed men who had been advancing. The sound of bullets hitting the ground and the distant echo of gunshots filled the air, but Forge and his crew didn't flinch. They were trained for this. They had done it before. Wrench, Storm, and Diesel moved with precision, taking out the enemy one by one, their movements fluid and coordinated. Phantom's sharp eyes never left his target, and Forge kept his rifle steady, picking off any threat that came into view. The fight raged on, but Forge knew they couldn't keep this up forever. They needed to end it now. He motioned for the others to fall back toward the outpost, their bikes still parked in position. The girl was the priority. Forge's heart raced as he turned to see her still hidden behind Diesel. She was safe for now, but they couldn't risk staying here much longer. Cole's men were regrouping, and more reinforcements were on their way. Fall back to the bikes. Forge shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. Get her to safety now. The bikers fell back, covering each other as they retreated toward their bikes. The sound of gunfire continued to echo behind them, but Forge didn't look back. His focus was on getting the girl to safety. They couldn't afford to get cornered. As the group made it to the bikes, Forge took one last glance behind him. Cole was still standing there, his face twisted in anger, his eyes locked on Forge. You're not getting away, Cole shouted. This isn't over. But Forge didn't respond. He didn't need to. He had one goal now, getting out alive and keeping the girl safe. He revved his engine, the roar of the bike cutting through the noise. Let's go, he said, his voice calm but urgent. The bikers mounted their bikes and tore out of the clearing, the sound of the engines deafening as they sped away. Behind them, the facility and the chaos they had left behind faded into the distance. Forge's heart was still racing, but he allowed himself a moment of relief. They had survived the fight, and for now, they had the girl. But deep down, Forge knew this was just the beginning. There were still many unanswered questions, and they were far from being out of danger. As they rode through the forest, Forge glanced at the girl once more. She was safe for now, but they had a long road ahead. He couldn't let his guard down. Not yet. The girl's eyes met his, and for the first time since they had met her, Forge saw something he hadn't seen before. Trust. She knew they weren't going to stop until they had taken down whatever was behind Project Silent Night. And neither was he. The roar of the motorcycles faded into the distance as Forge and his crew continued their ride through the dense woods. The danger had not passed, but for the first time in what felt like days, Forge allowed himself a brief moment of relief. They had escaped the facility and the pursuit, but the weight of the situation still hung heavy. The girl, her face pale but determined, was nestled behind Diesel, holding on tightly as they sped through the forest. She was safe for now, but Forge knew that this wasn't over. They had a long road ahead, and Project Silent Night was still a shadow hanging over them. The air was thick with tension, but Forge couldn't afford to show any fear. He kept his eyes on the path ahead, scanning the terrain, always alert for any sign of danger. The rest of the crew followed close behind, their engines humming in sync as they moved deeper into the forest. The sound of their bikes was the only thing breaking the silence of the trees, but Forge knew the stillness wouldn't last. They had to make it to the safe house, a remote cabin a few miles away, where they could regroup and plan their next move. As they approached the edge of the forest, the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the trail. The clearing was just ahead, and Forge's heart quickened as they reached the secluded cabin. The crew dismounted, and Diesel immediately helped the girl off the bike. She wobbled slightly, still disoriented from the stress of the past few days, but she was stronger than she looked. Forge gave her a reassuring nod as they moved toward the cabin, the sound of their boots crunching on the gravel beneath them. The place was small, but it was the perfect hideout. Hidden away in the woods, it was almost impossible to find unless you knew exactly where to look. It wasn't much, but it would give them the time they needed to think, to plan, and to figure out what to do next. Wrench and Phantom quickly checked the perimeter, making sure no one had followed them. The last thing they needed was another ambush. Storm and Diesel went inside to secure the cabin, while Forge stood outside, his mind racing. He couldn't stop thinking about the girl. What had she seen? What had she heard? She had been through more than any child should ever have to endure. And now, she was in the middle of something much bigger than herself. Forge couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. His instincts told him they were far from safe. He turned and glanced back at the others. "Keep your eyes open," he muttered. "We're not alone." The night was quickly settling in, and the forest seemed to grow darker with every passing minute. The sound of the wind rustling through the trees was the only thing keeping Forge's mind from going into overdrive. The girl had gone inside with Diesel, and Forge knew she needed rest, but he couldn't afford to let his guard down. Not yet. Wrench returned from his perimeter check, his face grim. No signs of anyone following. He said, his voice low, "But we can't let our guard down. There's no telling how far those people will go to find her." Forge nodded. He knew they couldn't stay in one place for long, but they needed a plan. "We can't keep running," Forge said, his voice steady. "We need to find out who's behind this, and we need to end it. For good." Storm, who had been listening, spoke up. "We can't go after them without more information. We don't know who we're up against. But I've got a friend who might be able to help. He's a tech guy, runs a private security firm. If anyone knows what's going on, it's him." Forge turned to Storm, his eyes narrowing. "How soon can you reach him?" Storm thought for a moment, then nodded. "I'll contact him tonight. He owes me a favor. If he's in, we can have more answers by tomorrow." Forge didn't hesitate. "Do it. We need to know everything." The girl's voice broke through their conversation. "I heard them talking," she said quietly, her voice barely a whisper. The bikers turned to look at her, and Diesel placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. She looked up at Forge, her eyes filled with fear and sadness. "They were going to use us, to do something horrible. They kept talking about Project Silent Night. They said it was going to change everything." Forge's heart sank as the pieces of the puzzle started to fall into place. Project Silent Night wasn't just about trafficking children. It was about something much darker, something that could change the world. And if they didn't stop it, more people, innocent people, would suffer. He stepped forward and knelt in front of the girl. "You're safe now," he said, his voice soft but firm. "We won't let them hurt you. We're going to end this, no matter what." The girl nodded slowly, her small face filled with a mixture of hope and fear. Forge turned back to his crew, his mind already working through the next steps. He didn't know how long they had before the people behind Project Silent Night would come for them, but he wasn't going to sit back and wait for it to happen. The bikers were used to taking matters into their own hands. They weren't backing down now. "We move at first light," Forge said, his voice steady. "We get answers, and we take them down. This ends now." As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, Forge stood outside the cabin, his face hardened with determination. The night had been restless, filled with the constant hum of worry in the back of his mind. He hadn't slept a wink, and neither had the others. They all knew that today was going to be the turning point. The moment they either found the answers they needed or fell deeper into the storm that was Project Silent Night. The girl, now sitting on a rough-hewn chair by the cabin's small window, was silent. She had told them everything she could remember, but Forge could see the toll it had taken on her. Her eyes were tired, haunted by the memories of the horrors she had witnessed. Yet, there was also a flicker of hope in her gaze, hope that she had never had before, hope that they would put an end to it all. Forge couldn't afford to let her down, not after everything she had been through. The others were preparing the bikes and checking their gear, but Forge needed a moment to gather his thoughts. He turned his attention back to the path ahead. It was a difficult road, and every step they took felt like they were walking on a razor's edge. Their enemies were still out there, waiting, and Forge knew they couldn't afford to be caught off guard again. Wrench, Storm, and Diesel had set up a perimeter, making sure no one approached the cabin while they were inside. Phantom was already on the phone, contacting his friend from the private security firm. If anyone could provide the information they needed to bring down Project Silent Night, it was him. Forge paced back and forth, his mind replaying the conversations they'd had. The girl's words echoed in his head. Project Silent Night. What did it really mean? Why had they chosen her? And what were they planning to do with the children they had taken? His thoughts were interrupted when Storm appeared at the door, a look of concern on his face. I've got something, Storm said, his voice low. I've been in contact with my guy. He's got some intel, but we'll have to meet him in person. It's the only way to get everything we need. Forge nodded, a sense of urgency rising within him. They couldn't waste any more time. Where is he? Forge asked, his voice steady. He's out of town, about 50 miles to the east. There's a small town there. It's the best place to meet without drawing attention, Storm explained. Forge turned to the rest of the crew, who were already gathering their things. We're moving out, Forge said, his voice firm. We'll meet this guy, get the answers we need, and then we make our next move. No more waiting. The team quickly mounted their bikes, ready to go. Diesel helped the girl onto his bike, keeping a close eye on her as they set off, Forge leading the pack. The ride was tense, the weight of what lay ahead heavy on their shoulders. The morning air was cool, but it did little to ease the pressure they all felt. As they sped down the winding roads, Forge's mind raced. He thought about what they would find when they met Storm's contact. What would they learn about Project Silent Night? And would it be enough to bring those responsible to justice? The town Storm mentioned wasn't far, but Forge's instincts told him that things wouldn't go smoothly. They were walking into enemy territory, and they had no idea who they could trust. It didn't take long before they reached the outskirts of the town, the small cluster of buildings standing in stark contrast to the wilderness they had just ridden through. Forge signaled for the crew to slow down, their engines quieting as they approached. They parked their bikes in a secluded alleyway behind a rundown diner. This is it, Storm said, his eyes scanning the area. He'll be inside. We don't have much time. Forge nodded, his jaw clenched. They had come this far, and there was no turning back now. They entered the diner, the bell above the door jingling as they stepped inside. The place was nearly empty, save for a few locals sipping coffee in the corner. At the counter sat a man in a faded jacket, his back to the door. Storm motioned toward him, and Forge approached cautiously, his hand resting on the grip of his sidearm. The man turned slightly, glancing over his shoulder before standing up. He was in his mid-40s, with a weathered face and sharp eyes that immediately reminded Forge of someone who had seen too much. Storm, the man said, nodding. I didn't expect you to bring them. Storm shrugged, a small smile on his face. Desperate times, he said. The man's gaze shifted to Forge and the rest of the crew. His eyes lingered on the girl, who was standing quietly behind Diesel. You're the ones chasing after Silent Night, he said, his voice low. You don't know what you're getting yourselves into. Forge's heart tightened. Tell us what we need to know, he said, his tone calm but firm. We don't have time for games. The man eyed him for a moment before sighing. All right, you want the truth? Project Silent Night isn't just a few corrupt officials. It's bigger than that. It involves people in power, people who have been pulling strings for years. And those kids? They're being used for something far darker than you can imagine. They're being groomed to become assets for some of the most powerful organizations in the world. Forge felt a cold knot form in his stomach. This was worse than he thought. The man continued, his voice barely a whisper. If you're going to stop this, you'll need more than just guns and bikes. You'll need allies. And even then, it might already be too late. The words hit Forge like a punch to the gut. They were in deeper than they had ever imagined. But there was no turning back now. We'll do whatever it takes, Forge said, his voice resolute. Tell us what we need to do. Forge's mind raced as the man's words sank in. Project Silent Night wasn't just a local operation. It was far bigger, more dangerous, and more entrenched in the world's most powerful networks than anything he could have imagined. The kids weren't just victims. They were being groomed to become tools for a global conspiracy. His jaw clenched, and the weight of the mission ahead grew heavier. They couldn't just take down a few corrupt officials. They were facing a threat that could alter everything. Forge had known they were up against something big, but this was a monster. He took a deep breath and locked eyes with the man across from him. "How do we stop it?" Forge asked, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. The man's eyes flickered with something akin to caution before he leaned forward, his voice low and urgent. "You're not just fighting the people in this room, or the ones you've already met. You're up against a network of corporations, government figures, and even military units. They all have a stake in Project Silent Night, and they won't go down without a fight." Forge's mind went cold. They weren't just facing criminals. They were fighting a system that was so deeply woven into the fabric of society that it could tear everything apart. "You're talking about a war," Forge muttered. "What's the next step?" The man nodded grimly. "You'll need more than information. You'll need allies who can match their firepower, and even then, it's no guarantee." He paused, scanning the group with a knowing look. "But there's one way you can hit them hard. There's a facility about 200 miles from here. It's one of their main hubs. If you can destroy it, you'll cut off a major part of their operations. But that's only the beginning. You'll have to move fast and be ready to face anyone who stands in your way." The weight of the man's words hung heavy in the air. Forge's hands tightened around the edge of the table. A part of him knew that this wasn't just about taking down a facility. It was about sending a message to everyone who thought they could hide behind power and corruption. They weren't backing down now. "We don't have time for delays," Forge said, his voice cold. "We hit this place, and we hit it hard." The man hesitated before replying, his voice filled with grim resignation. "You'll need to be careful. They'll know you're coming, and they'll have their best people waiting for you. Don't underestimate them." "We've been underestimated before," Wrench replied, his voice sharp. "And we've always come out on top." Diesel, who had been silent up until now, spoke up. "We'll need to gather more intel. We can't just ride in guns blazing. We'll need to know the layout, their defenses, everything." Forge nodded. "Agreed. Storm, you're in charge of contacting your guy. We'll get what we can from him. The rest of you, prepare for a fight. This isn't going to be easy." The crew moved quickly, preparing for the mission ahead. Phantom took the lead on the communication front, making sure everything was in place for their next move. Wrench, Diesel, and Storm gathered their weapons, double-checking their gear, while Forge stood at the window, his mind racing with the plan. They were about to go up against a force unlike anything they had faced before, but Forge was more determined than ever. He wasn't just going to take down the facility. He was going to make sure everyone behind Project Silent Night paid for what they'd done. As the hours passed, the team worked in quiet intensity, their movements precise, their focus unwavering. Storm returned with the intel they needed, providing the group with the facility's location and key details about its security. It was a heavily guarded compound, with high fences, surveillance systems, and armed guards patrolling around the clock. Forge studied the information carefully, his mind calculating every possibility. They couldn't afford to waste any time, and they couldn't afford to make mistakes. "We'll hit them at dawn," Forge said, his voice steady. "That's when they'll be at their weakest. We'll hit fast, hit hard, and get out before they even know what hit them." The crew nodded in agreement. It was risky, but they were used to taking risks. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about making sure Project Silent Night never saw the light of day again. As the night stretched on, Forge took a final look around the cabin. His brothers were ready, their minds focused and sharp. The girl was safe for now, but Forge knew the real battle was about to begin. They were going to tear down the people who had hurt her and so many others, and nothing was going to stand in their way. "Let's move out," Forge said quietly. The crew mounted their bikes and set off into the night, the roar of the engines blending with the wind. The plan was in motion. There was no turning back. And as Forge rode ahead, he felt the weight of the mission ahead, but he also felt something else, a fierce, burning determination. They were going to end this, no matter the cost. The early morning light barely pierced the thick forest canopy as Forge and his crew navigated the rugged terrain, their engines roaring like a battle cry. The plan was set, and there was no turning back. The compound that housed Project Silent Night loomed ahead, its high fences and watchtowers marking the enemy's stronghold. Forge's pulse raced as he steered his bike through the dense forest, his thoughts focused on one goal: destroy the compound and put an end to the dark operation once and for all. The crew, fully prepared and determined, followed closely behind. Wrench, Storm, Phantom, and Diesel, their faces set in grim determination, rode with the same sense of urgency and purpose. Each of them knew what was at stake. This wasn't just another mission. It was a fight for justice, for the countless children whose lives had been shattered by the twisted plans of those in power. As they approached the compound, Forge signaled for the group to halt. They were close now, just a few hundred yards away, and Forge knew they had to be careful. The compound was heavily guarded, and any misstep could mean the end of their mission. He glanced at the crew, meeting each of their eyes. "We move fast, we move quiet," Forge said, his voice low but firm. "This is it. No mistakes." Diesel nodded, his expression hard, while Wrench checked his rifle, ensuring it was ready. Storm, as usual, was scanning the area, keeping a lookout for any signs of movement. The rest of the crew fell into position, their instincts kicking in as they readied for the next phase. The compound was surrounded by high fences, armed guards patrolling the perimeter, and multiple entry points that were heavily monitored. But Forge had planned for this. They weren't here to fight the entire facility. They were here to make a statement, to take down the heart of Project Silent Night. "Phantom, you're on surveillance," Forge said, his voice calm but commanding. "Let us know if anyone gets too close. The rest of you, get in position." Phantom, his sharp eyes already scanning the compound from the cover of the trees, nodded and moved into position. Forge led the crew around the perimeter, staying low and moving with precision. The adrenaline was high, but Forge kept his focus. Every step was calculated, every breath taken with the knowledge that failure wasn't an option. They reached a small service entrance that led into the compound. It was lightly guarded, and Forge knew this was their chance. He motioned for Wrench and Diesel to cover the area while he and Storm moved in to disable the security systems. "We're in," Storm whispered, his hands deftly working on the keypad. With a soft click, the door opened. The crew slipped inside, their movements fluid and quiet. The hallway was dimly lit, but Forge could see enough to know they were getting close. The air was thick with tension, and every corner they turned felt like another step into the heart of enemy territory. They moved swiftly, each member of the crew taking out the guards with practiced precision. Forge's eyes never stopped scanning, always on the lookout for any new threats. It didn't take long to find what they were looking for. The facility's control room stood ahead, a heavy steel door marking its entrance. Forge nodded to Storm, who quickly disabled the security lock. As the door creaked open, the room inside came into view. Screens filled with live feeds of the compound's various areas lined the walls. The operation was more extensive than Forge had imagined. Dozens of children, all part of Project Silent Night, were being held in cells, their futures decided by people who thought they could control them. Forge's stomach turned. "We found the heart of it," he muttered under his breath. But there was no time to dwell on the horror they'd uncovered. "Let's move," Forge commanded. The crew advanced toward the central control station, taking out the guards in their path. They reached the heart of the operation, the central computer system that controlled everything. Wrench moved quickly, planting explosives on the mainframe and securing the area. "This is it," Wrench said, his voice steady as he set the timer. "In 10 minutes, this place will be nothing but rubble." The team gathered around, making sure everything was in place. They were about to destroy the very thing that had caused so much pain and suffering. But as Forge looked around, he knew this was only the beginning. The network that controlled Project Silent Night extended far beyond this compound. There would be more battles to fight, more people to take down. But for now, they had won. The explosion rocked the building, sending shockwaves through the compound. The walls trembled, and a thick cloud of dust filled the air. Forge and his crew made their way out, their movements swift and coordinated. They had done it. The facility was gone. The children were free. But Forge's mind couldn't rest. There was still much to do. He glanced at the girl, who had remained hidden during the operation, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and hope. "It's over," Forge said, his voice steady as he approached her. She nodded, her small face breaking into a hesitant smile. "Thank you," she whispered. Forge gave her a brief nod before turning back to the crew. "This isn't over," he said, his voice filled with determination. "We've taken down one part of this operation, but we still have a long way to go. They won't stop, and neither will we." The crew mounted their bikes, the engines roaring to life as they rode off into the distance. The mission was complete, but the war was just beginning. Forge wasn't going to stop until every last person behind Project Silent Night was brought to justice. He wasn't just fighting for the girl anymore. He was fighting for every life that had been ruined by the darkness they had uncovered. The ride was long, but Forge knew they had made a difference. And as the road stretched ahead, he couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, there was a chance to put an end to the evil that had gripped so many lives. Get ready to dive into one of the most gripping and intense tales in the world of Hell Angel stories. As a group of hardened bikers embarks on a mission to rescue a young girl trapped in the dark world of human trafficking, they uncover a massive conspiracy known as Project Silent Night. This thrilling adventure follows their journey as they face impossible odds, navigate a world filled with corrupt officials and dangerous criminals, and fight to take down the operation that is destroying countless lives. Through heart-pounding action, unexpected twists, and the unbreakable bond between the bikers, this chapter in Hell Angel stories takes you deep into the heart of a mission that could change the world. With every mile they ride, the bikers get closer to their goal, but they quickly realize the stakes are much higher than they ever imagined. From the explosive action to the harrowing emotional moments, this story captures the essence of Hell Angel stories like never before, making you feel the intensity of every decision, every battle, and every risk they take. With enemies closing in and the mission reaching its climax, these bikers will stop at nothing to ensure justice is served, and in the end, they will. Show the world what true strength and loyalty look like. Hell Angels stories like this one are what legends are made of, where the stakes are high, and the bonds of brotherhood are tested to their limits. As they fight to take down Project Silent Night, the bikers prove that no matter the odds, the fight for freedom will always be worth it. This is not just another ride. This is a battle for survival and for the innocent lives caught in the crossfire. These Hell Angels stories deliver the action, the heart, and the thrill you crave, with a conclusion that will leave you on the edge of your seat, waiting for the next chapter in this epic journey.